socialist takeover.
This is extremism.
It's fascism.
In our highly polarized age, political labels aren't just words, they are weapons.
It's a progressive agenda fascist party.
You hear them everywhere. Online, at protests, in everyday arguments.
Law and order.
And part of the reason that happens is because people often reduce complex systems into simple, single terms. But if we want to understand political ideas, we have to go beyond labels.
Say no to the authoritarian takeover!
To better understand political and economic ideas, we first have to understand why people often use simplistic words to describe them.
People use single terms to explain complex political phenomena, frankly, because it's easier. It's a lot more efficient, it's faster.
This is just populist rhetoric for crypto.
Conservative.
Labels are very powerful, I think especially in the political realm, but I think they can be misleading because they are oversimplistic.
Well, there's a lot of motivations for why people simplify these political labels. One is that it helps identify people's tribes, or actually set them apart from some other tribe that they disagree with.
This is fascist!
So those people over there, they're the fascists, they're the communists. I think there's a sense of moral superiority that comes from using these terms to differentiate yourself from the enemy as the good guy, a person who has good, decent, honest values.
A conservative conspiracy
Part of a
theory
liberal plan to replace.
But what these words actually mean is often vague, distorted, or just plain wrong. And when that happens, people stop explaining and start attacking.
People are talking past each other because they fundamentally are involved in sort of a conflict machine.
It's always profits
It's the
over equity
hardline
with you
conservatives who are
capitalists.
blocking spending.
They're highly partisan, and they start using these labels to demonize the other group without really any fundamental understanding or discernment of what those labels and terms mean.
Political labels can be useful, but they can also be misleading. So if we want political conversations to make sense, we have to start by defining what these words actually mean. Dr. Rainer Zeitelmann is a German author, historian, and sociologist who has spent decades studying political ideology, economic systems, and the history of freedom.
Most people still picture politics using one simple model: left, right. But that only works if politics is answering one question, and it isn't.
This construct of a left-right political label, it's a very simple concept, and it goes back hundreds of years, back to the French Revolution in 1789, when those who supported the monarchy and the king sat on the right side of the aisle, and those who supported revolution and the will of the people sat on the left. And that was fine in its day, but the problem there is that political ideas of democratic systems of governance have become much more complex, and people can hold all sorts of different complicated views on different issues without neatly fitting into that left-right spectrum.
Today, most people talk about left and right in terms of money and fairness. The left wants government to do more: taxes, programs, rules on business, more equality of outcome. The right wants government to do less: lower taxes, fewer regulations, and less constraints on markets. Other popular labels are liberal and conservative. Very broadly, liberals are more okay with change in government programs to fix problems, so they tend towards the left. Conservatives embrace tradition and use markets to address problems, so they lean to the right. Another example is socialism versus capitalism. On a basic left-right axis, socialism sits on the left because it wants more governmental control of the economy, while capitalism sits on the right because it favors private ownership and freer markets. The left-right spectrum isn't useless, but it can be misleading because it compresses multiple political and economic questions into a single line.
This fact alone reveals the first fundamental error in today's political discourse. Economic systems and political systems are not the same thing, and conflating them onto a single left-right line leads to confusion.
One of the big shortcomings of using this left-right axis is that you can think of it as just flattens the complexity of what people are feeling. Left has a bundle of both social and economic, but it also has a lot of cultural implications, just as the right does. So we're losing a lot of nuance in people's opinions and their values if you just use this binary of left or right.
Economic systems matter. Political philosophy matters. But another question may matter even more. How much power should a government exercise over individual lives? In its classical sense, a libertarian outlook is about limiting concentrated political power. Libertarian systems are built around the idea that individuals have certain rights that governments must respect. Authoritarian systems move in the opposite direction. Power becomes more concentrated, institutions become less independent, and citizens have fewer reliable ways to challenge decisions. But even here, actual political systems are more complicated than a few familiar labels. If labels can be misleading,
Radical. Socialist. Communist.
and one line can oversimplify reality, then we need better tools to understand how political systems actually work. Tools like the Nolan chart help us see what political labels often miss.
In 1969, David Nolan, who was an MIT graduate, developed the Nolan chart. The Nolan chart takes that left-right traditional spectrum and it adds an additional dimension right through the middle of that and says, no, wait. There's actually something very fundamental in this political discourse that we need to be talking about. And that is, to what degree is government intervening across various different dimensions in your life?
And once you add that second dimension, you can start to see systems more clearly. The horizontal axis measures economic freedom. The vertical one measures personal freedom. When you look at both together, you get a clearer picture why many people don't fit into a simple left-right label. Take two students who both describe themselves as left-wing. Both support higher taxes and government programs like subsidized college loans. On a simple left-right line, they look identical. But ask another question. Should the government also control speech, media, or protests? One student believes free speech should always be protected. The other thinks dangerous speech should be banned. On the Nolan chart, they split apart. They agree about the economy, but they disagree about how much control the government should have. You see the same thing on the economic right. Two people might both support lower taxes and fewer business regulations to help entrepreneurs to start companies. But they can strongly disagree about personal freedom. One believes individuals should decide what they read, what they watch, or who they marry. The other supports government bans on certain books, restricting protests, and enforcing strict moral laws. On the Nolan chart, they land in very different places. They agree about economic freedom, but they disagree about personal freedom. The same pattern shows up in everyday life. Take a common debate many families face today, restricting teenagers' use of smartphones and social media.
If we're just looking at the left-right choice, the left would most likely say we would like to keep social media more open. The right might say we would like to keep constraints on social media because we think it's harmful for communities, we think it's harmful for young minds. Now, if we're looking at this specific issue in the Nolan chart example, it's not necessarily left and right. This is actually more of a personal freedom issue. Do you think the government should have this decision, or do you think this should be a personal decision, which the Nolan chart allows you to add complexity into?
I'm a bit of an authoritarian when it comes to how my daughter is able to use and access her smartphone. I do control and regulate the usage of the cell phone in the household. But similar principles tend to apply. Let's look at the role of government and what these different groups feel how should government be involved, it really does help to home in on how people are thinking about political ideology.
History gives us some of the clearest examples of what happens when political power becomes concentrated, and when economic decisions become tied to political control.
History shows us that labels can hide how power actually works. And when that happens, people can miss warning signs. Few figures are named more often or more wrongly than Adolf Hitler. His name is often used to end arguments, not to understand how power actually worked.
Even the name of Hitler's political party is misleading. It was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, a label that still causes confusion today.
One has to distinguish between classical socialism, which abolished private property and nationalized everything, and modern socialism, where private property formally exists, but the state determines what may be done with it. National socialism is an example of this modern socialism. Often one hears the word Nazi. It's important to know something about the origins of this word. The National Socialists didn't coin the word Nazi, they called themselves National Socialists. Nazi was originally a polemical term used by the enemies, especially on the left. The left did not want to call them National Socialists because the word socialism appears in that name, which they regarded as almost sacred. So they used other labels and called the National Socialists Nazis or fascists. The main point was that the word socialism did not appear in the name. In Hitler's Germany, businesses were technically private, but the government told them what to produce, what prices to charge, who to buy from, and who to sell to. So the business owner wasn't really an independent entrepreneur anymore. He was more like a manager working for the state. If the government controls your major business decisions, private property is mostly an illusion. It exists legally, but not in reality. Once fear replaces law, power no longer needs support, only compliance. Seen through this lens, Hitler's Germany becomes easier to understand. Extreme political control, heavy state direction of the economy, private businesses, but only at the state's discretion. What's important to understand is that this process isn't unique to Hitler's Germany. These steps appear in many authoritarian regimes across very different political ideologies.
For millions of people today, this isn't history. It's real life. In Venezuela, socialism wasn't just a theory. It became a real-world experiment carried out in one of the most resource-rich countries on Earth. Daniel DiMartino grew up in Venezuela under the socialist government of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro.
When people talk about socialism, they usually discuss Cuba, they discuss the Soviet Union, they talk about China, but none of those countries were rich like Venezuela was. Venezuela had the largest oil reserves in the planet. So if socialism was going to work somewhere in the world, it was going to be in Venezuela. If you have free money literally flowing up from the ground, how could you just not give free things? Yet that's not what happened. When Hugo Chavez was first elected in Venezuela, it was under the promise that he would redistribute the oil revenues fairly and that he would take from the rich to enrich the poor, essentially. However, what really happened was that the rich fled and the poor became poorer. The country, despite having the largest oil reserves, lacked gasoline. People had to line up for gasoline for hours or even for days. In a tropical country, we ran out of vegetables. The farmers couldn't produce. We had to line up in the grocery stores. My teacher in high school would dismiss class because a friend that works at a grocery store nearby would text her telling her, chicken is here, come line up first before everybody gets here. And so we would be without class because the teacher is doing something very rational, which is trying to provide for her family, of course. People will tell you that what happened in Venezuela had nothing to do with socialism, that it's just a corrupt government or mismanagement. And of course, it is a corrupt government. It's an evil dictatorship. But socialism is government ownership or control over the means of production. The policies that the Venezuelan regime pursued were socialist policies. Number one was nationalizations. They took people's businesses. Price controls. The government would tell you how much you can charge for your product or service. If you're a bakery, how much you can charge for cakes or bread, how much you can charge for flour. If you're a grocery store, how much you can charge for eggs, how much you can charge for rent if you're a landlord. So when you destroy private property, when you destroy the profit motive, you eliminate the price system and you destroy the economy. It's that simple.
Seen through this lens, Venezuela falls into the lower left quadrant, with low economic freedom as well as low personal freedom.
Venezuela moved from being the 10th most economically free nation in 1970, according to the Fraser Institute, to being in the bottom 5 by 2020. So in 50 years, Venezuela went from being a top 10 nation to a bottom 10 nation. No other country in human history has been so free as Venezuela and then become so unfree as Venezuela has.
When people are free to build, compete, and trade, societies tend to be more innovative and prosperous. After World War II, East and West Germany started at almost the same point. The same culture, the same people, the same history. The difference was the economic system. West Germany implemented a market economy and quickly became one of the richest countries in the world. East Germany implemented socialism and fell further and further behind. History shows us how freedom is lost, but it also shows us how it can be protected. Societies that protect economic freedom and political freedom tend to produce innovation, opportunity, and rising living standards.
History doesn't just give us labels. It reveals patterns in how power grows and how freedom can slowly disappear.
If we want better political conversations, we have to move beyond labels and start asking better questions about freedom, about power, and about how systems actually work. Because when people understand how power really works, labels lose their power.
Labels don't protect societies. Understanding does. Because when ideas are reduced to slogans, dangerous ideas can spread. Clarity isn't just academic. It's how free societies survive.